5000 নেওয়া যাবে। রেডি? আউযু বিল্লাহি মিনাশ শাইতানির রাজীম। বিসমিল্লাহির রহমানির রহিম। আলহামদুলিল্লাহি নাস্তাঈনুহু ওয়া নাস্তাগফিরুহু ওয়া নাউযু বিল্লাহি মিন শুরুরি আনফুসিনা মান ইয়াহদিল্লাহু ফালা মুদিল্লা লাহু ওয়া মান ইউদ্লিলহু ফালা হাদিয়া লাহু ওয়া নাশহাদু আন লা ইলাহা ইল্লাল্লাহু ওয়াহদাহু লা শারীকা লাহু ওয়া নাশহাদু আন্না মুহাম্মাদান আবদুহু ওয়া রাসূলুহু আরসালাহু বিল হাক্কি বাশীরাও ওয়ান নাযীরান বাইনা ইয়াদাইস সাআ মান ইউতি'ইল্লাহা ওয়া রাসূলাহু ফাকাদ রাশাদ ওয়া মান ইয়াসিহিমা ফাইন্নাহু লা ইয়াদুররু ইল্লা নাফসাহু ওয়া লা ইয়াদুররুল্লাহা শাইআ ফাকাদ ক্বালা আল্লাহু তাআলা ফিল কুরআনিল মাজিদ ইন্নাল্লাহা ওয়া মালাইকাতাহু ইউসাল্লুনা আলান নাবী ইয়া আইয়ুহাল্লাযীনা আমানু সাল্লু আলাইহি ওয়া সাল্লিমু তাসলিমা আল্লাহুম্মা সাল্লি আলা মুহাম্মাদিন ওয়া আলা আলি মুহাম্মাদ কামা সাল্লাইতা আলা ইব্রাহিম ওয়া আলা আলি ইব্রাহিম ইন্নাকা হামিদুম মাজিদ আল্লাহুম্মা বারিক আলা মুহাম্মাদিন ওয়া আলা আলি মুহাম্মাদ কামা বারাকতা আলা ইব্রাহিম ওয়া আলা আলি ইব্রাহিম ইন্নাকা হামিদুম মাজিদ রব্বি ইশরাহ লি সাদরি ওয়া ইয়াসসির লি আমরি ওয়াহলুল উকদাতাম মিন লিসানি ইয়াফকাহু কওলি রব্বি জিদনি ইলমা সুবহানাল্লাহি ওয়া বিহামদিহি সুবহানাল্লাহিল আযীম। My dear audiences, friends, brothers and sisters, those who are watching through Facebook, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It is a great pleasure for me to attend this Tafsirul Qur'an Mahfil, and at the very beginning of this Tafsirul Qur'an Mahfil, I would like to express my deep gratitude to our only one Creator, Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by saying Alhamdulillah, all praises are for Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inshallah, in today's Tafsirul Qur'an Mahfil, we shall have a discussion on verse number 200 of Suratu Ali Emraan. There are as many as 200 verses or ayats in surah number 3, Suratu Ali Emraan, and verse number 200 is the last verse, last ayat. Now inshallah, in today's Tafsirul Qur'an Mahfil, we shall have a discussion on this verse number 200 of Suratu Ali Imran. So as usual, at the very beginning, we shall go to the recitation as well as meaning of this verse, of this ayat. Then inshallah, we shall go to the elaborate discussion. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Ya ayyuhallazina amanu isbiru wa sabiru wa rabitu wattaqullah لعلكم تفلحون صدق الله العلي العظيم وصدق رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين سبحان الله وبحمده سبحان الله العظيم اللهم صل على محمد عبدك ورسولك. I seek refuge, I seek shelter to Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the accursed devil, from the accursed shaitan, and I am beginning with the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the most merciful, most beneficent. Ya ayyuhallazina amanu isbiru wasabiru warabitu. Oh, the believers of Islam, keep patience and try to be a perseverant and try to be firm, determined. Wattaqullah, fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. La'allakum tuflihun, and it is hoped that you will be succeeded. Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said the truth, and His prophets and messengers have also said the truth, and we are among the witnesses. All praises are for Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All praises are for Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the greatest. O Allah, bless your Prophet and servant Hazrat Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So this was the recitation as well as meaning of verse number 200, last verse of Suratu Ali Emraan. In this verse, verse number 200, Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has narrated a virtue of believer of Islam. A mu'min, that means believer of Islam, will have to have so many virtues, so many characteristics, so many qualities. Among them, one of the most important quality, most important virtue is having patience, becoming patient. A believer of Islam must be patient in all respect of his lives. In order to lead our life, as we know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed this Holy Qur'an, directing us how we shall lead our personal life, how we shall lead our family life, how we shall lead our social life, as well as how we shall lead our national life. Personal life, family life, social life, as well as national life. In everywhere there is a quality, there is a characteristic, there is a virtue which is required a lot, and that is patience. In Arabic it is say as-sabru. As-sabru, that means patience. As you know, when a person is ill, when a person is sick, when a person is facing ailment, when a person is suffering from many diseases, we used to call them a patient. Why? Because a person who is facing so many troubles, so many difficulties, in spite of having so many troubles, so many patients, he is controlling himself. Because he is having patience. Since he is having patience, he or she is having patience, we called them patient. So patience is a great virtue. And in our student life, we learned a proverb. Patience is bitter, but its fruit is sweet. Every one of us have learned this proverb during our student life. And we used to say that this is the utterance of a scholar, this is the utterance of a learned man. In fact, patience is bitter, but its fruit is sweet. It is not the utterance of any scholar, it is not the saying of any learned man. In fact, it is the utterance, it is the saying of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala about 1500 years ago in the Holy Qur'an. Patience is bitter, but its fruit is sweet. It is not a proverb, it is the utterance, it is the narration of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Qur'an about 1500 years ago. Allahu Akbar. So in verse number 200, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing a quality, a characteristic, a virtue of an actual believer of Islam. An actual believer of Islam must have patience in his life, in the four corners of his life. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is directing us, Ya ayyuhallazina amanusbiru, O the believers of Islam, be patient, keep patience. Wasabiru, and try again and again, perseverance. Try again and again. Warabitu, and have firm determination. So, in today's Tafsirul Mahfil, inshallah, we shall discuss on patience. At first, we shall go to the other relevant verses from the Holy Quran, in other surah. Those are relevant in today's tafsir. At first, we shall go to verse number 153 from Suratu Baqarah, which is relevant in today's tafsir. In verse number 153, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ista'inu bis-sabri was-salah, inna Allaha ma'as sabirin. O the believers of Islam, seek help of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by having patience and offering prayers. Inna Allaha ma'as sabirin. Obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with those who are patient. This was verse number 153 from Suratul Baqarah, relevant in today's tafsir, where Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has directed us to seek His help, to seek His support by having patience as well as by offering prayers. And in the next portion of this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has categorically stated, Inna Allaha ma'as sabirin. Obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with those who are patient. Allahu Akbar. So this was verse number 153 from Suratul Baqarah, relevant in today's tafsir. Next relevant verse in today's tafsir is verse number 17 from Suratu Emraan. In verse number 17, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given some characteristics. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has narrated some qualities, some virtues of an actual believer of Islam. That means characteristics, virtues of a mu'min. What are the characteristics of a mu'min? What are the virtues of an actual believer of Islam? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, الصابرين والصادقين والقانتين والمنفقين والمستغفرين بالأسحار. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that an actual believer of Islam, he must be patient. That means he will keep patience. This is the first virtue of an actual believer of Islam, of a mu'min. Next virtue is was-sadiqin. An actual believer of Islam will be always truthful. We say, always speak the truth. It is a proverb. No. Always speak the truth. It is not proverb. It is not the utterance of any person. It is not the saying of any scholar. In fact, it is the saying of our only one Creator, Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, about 1,500 years ago in the Holy Qur'an. Always speak the truth. This is the direction of our only one Creator, Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, about 1,500 years ago. And third characteristics, third virtue of a believer of Islam is wal qanitin. He will be obedient to Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wal munfiqin. He will spend his money in the way of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wal mustaghfirina bil ashar. A true and actual believer of Islam will seek forgiveness to Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during dawn, during the last portion of the night. During Ramadan, month of Ramadan, we used to have Sahari. Sahari means last portion of the night. That is the first portion of the dawn. That means an actual believer of Islam used to seek forgiveness to Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the last portion of the night, before the morning. So we were discussing on patience, and in verse number 17, Suratu Emraan, Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has narrated some characteristics, virtues, qualities of an actual believer of Islam, of a mu'min, and among the virtues, the patience is narrated at first. Next relevant verse in today's tafsir is verse number 124 to 125, Suratu Emraan. In verse number 124 to 125, Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, إِذْ تَقُولُ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ أَلَنْ يَكْفِيَكُمْ أَنْ يُمِدَّكُمْ رَبُّكُمْ بِثَلَاثَةِ آلَافٍ مِّنَ الْمَلَائِكَةِ مُنْزَلِينَ بَلَى إِن تَصْبِرُوا وَتَتَّقُوا وَيَأْتُوكُم مِّنْ فَوْرِهِمْ هَذَا يُمْدِدْكُمْ رَبُّكُمْ بِخَمْسَةِ آلَافٍ مِّنَ الْمَلَائِكَةِ مُسَوِّمِينَ. These verses are revealed upon our beloved Prophet during the battle of Uhud. As we know, during the battle of Uhud, our beloved Prophet started to face the non-believer of Islam who came from Mecca to destroy the Islamic State formed in Medina. And our beloved Prophet, with a soldier, as many as 1,000 soldiers, went there to face the non-believers of Islam. And they were 3,000 in number, and Muslims were 1,000 in number. But Abdullah ibn Ubay, who was the leader of hypocrites, Munafiq, he left the battlefield with 300 soldiers of his own, thinking that Muslim will be defeated in this battle. And when 300 soldiers were taken away by Abdullah ibn Ubay from the Muslim soldiers, tribes, namely Banu Haresa and Banu Salama, who were the tribes of Ansar, they became afraid. And at that time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made their steps firm. And our beloved Prophet told them, إِذْ تَقُولُوا لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ عَلَيْ يَكْفِيَكُمْ أَن يُمِدَّكُمْ رَبُّكُمْ بِثَلَاثَ آلَافٍ مِّنَ الْمَلَائِكَةِ مُنْزَلِينَ. Our beloved Prophet told the Muslim soldiers, will 3,000 angels sent by Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not be enough to defeat the soldiers of the non-believers? In order to encourage the Muslim soldiers, our beloved Prophet told this. And Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Bala in tasbiru wa tattaqu wa ya'tukum min fawrihim hadha yumdidukum rabbukum bi khamsati alafim minal malaikati musawwimin. Obviously, if you keep patience, I have selected this verse because here the word patience have been used by Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The word as-sabru has been used by Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Bala in tasbiru. Obviously, Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will help you if you keep patience. Wattaku, and fear Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you do these two things, Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will help you against the non-believers of Islam if they attack suddenly by sending 5,000 angels. Allahu Akbar. So, in order to have help, in order to have support from Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is the precondition of a believer of Islam to remain on patience. To be patient is the precondition in order to have support from Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said in verse number 124 and 125, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will help you by sending not 3,000 angels, 5,000 angels will be sent down for your help. But at first you must keep patience. Nowadays we are making prayers to Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but our prayers are not accepted. Why? We do not have patience. We have lost our patience. And an actual believer of Islam, a mu'min, will never lose his patience. A mu'min, an actual believer of Islam, will always have patience. On the way of our life, we may face difficulties, we may face troubles, we may face danger. And during that period, an actual believer of Islam will always have patience. He will never lose his patience, because it is the virtue, it is the characteristic, it is the quality of a believer of Islam, of an actual believer of Islam, that he will keep patience in every step of his life. Now relevant verse in today's tafsir is verse number 34 from Suratul An'am. Verse number 34, Suratul An'am, Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَلَقَدْ كُذِّبَتْ رُسُلٌ مِّن قَبْلِكَ فَصَبَرُوا عَلَى مَا كُذِّبُوا وَأُوذُوا حَتَّى أَتَاهُمْ نَصْرُنَا our Creator, Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is encouraging our beloved Prophet by saying that the non-believers of Islam are rejecting your invitation of Tawheed. And you remember that earlier all the prophets and messengers were declared liar. All the prophets and messengers were rejected by the non-believer of Islam. So, since the non-believers of Islam are not accepting your invitation of Tawheed, don't be anxious, don't be disappointed, don't be disheartened. Because earlier all the prophets and messengers were rejected by the non-believers of Islam when they invited people towards the oneness of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, whenever we shall invite people under the shelter of Islam, we shall invite people under the shelter of Tawheed, under the shelter of oneness of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, many times they will reject our invitation. And at that time, we, the believers of Islam, will never lose our patience. We shall always keep our patience. Next, this was verse number 34 from Suratu An'am. Next relevant verse in today's tafsir is verse number 65 from Suratu Anfal. In verse number 65, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Ya ayyuhan nabiyyu hurrizal mu'minina alal qital iyakum minkum isruna sabiruna yaglibu miyatain wa iyakum minkum mi'atui yaglibu alfam minal ladzina kafaru biannahum qawmun la yafqahun. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving a nice direction to us. If we keep patience, what will be the result? What will be the consequence? In order to face a non-believer of Islam, in order to face the difficulties, troubles, danger made by the non-believers of Islam, a true and actual believer of Islam must have patience. And if he keeps his patience, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that 20 believers of Islam will defeat 200 non-believers of Islam. Allahu Akbar. That means a believer of Islam is 10 times stronger than the non-believers of Islam. And if a believers of Islam gathered 1,000, they will defeat a believer of Islam gather 100, they will defeat 1,000 non-believer of Islam. That means in verse number 65, Suratul Anfal, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking our beloved Prophet to encourage the actual believer of Islam, Mu'min, towards the battle, towards the fight, saying that an actual believer of Islam is 10 times stronger than the non-believer of Islam. Allahu Akbar. So, we the Muslims of this world, we are 10 times stronger than the non-believers of Islam. So we do not need to be anxious. We do not need to be disappointed. We do not need to be disheartened. Because we are 10 times stronger than the non-believers of Islam. Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has declared this in verse number 65, Suratul Anfal. Next relevant verse in today's tafsir is verse number 127, Suratul Nahl. In verse number 127, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Wasbir wama sabruka illa billah wala tahzan alayhim وَلَا تَكُوا فِي ضَيْقٍ مِّمَّا يَمْكُرُونَ. Keep patience. And patience comes from Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is all power, who belongs all power. So if we keep patience, we must believe that patience comes by the help of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And our Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has asked us not to be disappointed, not to be disheartened. They may make many plots, many tricks, but because of their tricks, because of their plots, a Muslim, an actual believer of Islam, a mu'min will never become disappointed. He will keep patience, and he must remember that if he keeps patience, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with him. So this was verse number 127, Suratu Nahl. Here Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked us to have patience. Next relevant verse in today's tafsir is verse number 111. Verse number 111 of Suratul Mu'minun. Here Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Inni khazaituhumul yawma bima sabaru annahum humul faizun. Whoever will have patience, he will be rewarded on the day of judgment, and that will be the great success. So having patience is one of the best worship of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes we see that when people face some difficulties, face troubles, face some danger, they become disappointed. No, a true Muslim will never become disappointed. A true Muslim will never become anxious. Whenever he will face any difficulty, any trouble, any danger, he must keep patience, and he will rely on Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He will pray to Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for early recovery from the trouble, from the difficulties, from the danger. Next relevant verse in today's tafsir is verse number 43 from Suratu Shura. In verse number 43, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَلَمَنْ صَبَرَ وَغَفَرَ إِنَّ ذَلِكَ لَمِنْ عَزْمِ الْأُمُورِ. Whoever keep patience and forgive people, it is a great job. We say sometimes that there is a proverb, forgiveness is a great virtue. No, forgiveness is a great virtue. It is not a proverb. It is not saying. It is not the utterance of any learned man or of a scholar. Forgiveness is a great virtue. It is the utterance of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Qur'an about 1500 years ago. In verse number 43, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying this. وَلَمَنْ صَبَرَ وَغَفَرَ إِنَّ ذَلِكَ لَمِنْ عَزْمِ الْأُمُورِ. Whoever keep patience and whoever forgives people, it is a great job. It is a great deed. Allahu Akbar. Next relevant verse. So this was verse number 43 from Suratu Shura. Next relevant verse in today's tafsir is verse number 35. Suratul Ahqaf. In verse number 35, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Fasbir kama sabara ulul azmi minar rusuli wa la tasta'jil lahum. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is encouraging our beloved Prophet by saying that, oh my Prophet, keep patience like the patience of the messengers and prophets who were sent earlier, and don't make hurriness for the non-believers of Islam. That means whenever our beloved Prophet started to ask people under the shelter of Tawheed, under the shelter of oneness of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the non-Muslims, the non-believers of Islam were rejecting his invitation. And sometimes our beloved Prophet became disappointed, disheartened. Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is encouraging him. Our Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is comforting him. Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is consoling him by saying that don't be impatient, because earlier all the prophets and messengers were rejected by them. And don't make hurriness. Have patience and go forward slowly. Allahu Akbar. Can you imagine our beloved Prophet invited people towards the Tawheed, towards the oneness of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his prophethood of his life in Makkah about 13 years. Very slowly he invited people towards the oneness of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For the 13 years in Makkah, he invited people towards the Tawheed. So whenever we shall try to spread the teachings of Islam, we shall try to spread the teachings of oneness of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we must not make hurriness. We must not make haste. We shall keep patience and we shall go forward, step by step. So this was verse number 35 from Suratu Ahqaf. Next relevant verse in today's tafsir is verse number 5 from Suratu Ma'arij. In verse number 5, Suratul Ma'arij, Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Fasbir sabran jamila. O Prophet, have patience and have nice patience, excellent patience. Jamilun means beautiful. That means patience is the beauty of Islam. An actual believer of Islam will always keep patience. He will never be impatient. Fasbir sabran jamila. Verse number 5 from Suratul Ma'arij. Next relevant verse in today's tafsir is verse number 7 from Suratul Muddassir. Here Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Wali Rabbika Fasbir, O Prophet, keep patience for the sake of your God. For the sake of your only one Creator, Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, keep patience. Wali Rabbika Fasbir. O Prophet, have patience. O Prophet, keep patience for the sake of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allahu Akbar. That means whenever we will face any difficulty, whenever we will face any trouble in our life, when we will face any danger in our life, we must keep patience, because keeping patience means keeping patience for the sake of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wali Rabbika Fasbir, verse number 7 from Suratul Muddassir. Allahu Akbar. Next relevant verse in today's tafsir is verse number 24 from Suratu Dahar. Verse number 24, Surah Ad-Dahar, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Fasbir li hukmi rabbika wa la tuti' minhum athiman aw kafura. O Prophet, keep patience and keep patience by the order of your only one Creator. And don't follow the non-believers of Islam and the sinners. That means Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directed our beloved Prophet to have patience, to keep patience in all respect of life. And it is mandatory, obligatory for each and every actual believer of Islam to remain, to keep patience, to have patience. And patience is bitter, but its fruit is sweet. It is the utterances of Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Qur'an about 1500 years ago. Now inshallah, we shall go to some relevant hadiths. Those are relevant in today's tafsir. An Abi Hurairah radhiyallahu anhu, anna Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam qala, laysa ash-shadidu bis-sur'ati, innamas shadidu allazi yamliku nafsahu indal ghadabi. Rawahu Muslim. Sometimes we watch wrestling. In wrestling, fight, in wrestling, we say wrestling. A strong man defeats another strong man. But our beloved Prophet is saying, he is the actual strong man who control himself during the angry. He is not the strong man who defeat another strong man in the struggle, in the wrestling. In fact, he is the actual strong who keep patience at the time of anger. Rawahu Muslim. During anger, controlling oneself is very necessary, because if we have a look in our four corners, we shall find that many occurrences, many crimes are being occurred due to anger. And our beloved Prophet directed us to keep patience at the time of anger. Whenever we shall become angry, we must keep patience. And he who keeps patience during his anger, he is the actual strong man. Rawahu Muslim. Next relevant verse, hadith in today's tafsir is An Abi Hurairah radhiyallahu anhu, anna rajulan qala lin Nabiy sallallahu alayhi wasallam usini qala la taghdab faraddu miraran qala la taghdab. Rawahu al-Bukhari. This hadith has been narrated by Abu Hurairah radhiyallahu anhu. He said, a man came to our beloved Prophet and he asked our beloved Prophet to teach him something. Our beloved Prophet told him, don't become angry. And the person who came to our beloved Prophet asked on several times, teach me something. Our beloved Prophet in all times told him not to be angry. Allahu Akbar. Rawahu al-Bukhari. Not to become angry is a great virtue, and it is the virtue of actual believer of Islam. That is, it is the virtue of a mu'min. Rawahu al-Bukhari. An Abi Hurairah radhiyallahu anhu qala Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam man yuridillahu bihi khayran yusib minhu. Rawahu al-Bukhari. This hadith has been narrated by Hazrat Abu Hurairah radhiyallahu anhu. He said, our beloved Prophet has said that whoever to whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants welfare, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throw him in trouble, in danger. Man yuridillahu bihi khairan yusib minhu. Rawahu al-Bukhari. Sometimes whenever we face some difficulties, whenever we face some trouble, we become impatient. No. Whenever we shall face any trouble, any difficulties, any danger, we must believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants our welfare, and for that reason we have been thrown in this in this trouble, in this danger, in this difficulty. So facing difficulty, facing trouble, facing danger does not mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has left you. No. Facing trouble, facing difficulty, facing danger means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with you. So, having patience is a great virtue. Having patience is a virtue of an actual believer of Islam. That is, having patience is the virtue of a mu'min. And inshallah, we shall always try to have patience in every step of our life. Now inshallah we shall have prayer, and before offering prayer, let us recite durood. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Allahumma barik ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Allahumma amin. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم اللهم اغفر لحينا وميتنا وشاهدنا وغائبنا وصغيرنا وكبيرنا وذكرنا وأنثانا اللهم من أحييته منا فأحيه على الإسلام ومن توفيته منا فتوفه على الإيمان ربنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار رب ارحمهما كما ربياني صغيرا رب هب لي من الصالحين اللهم إني أسألك الهدى والتقى والعفاف والغنى والله. Some of your servants have gathered here in this Tafsirul Qur'an Mahfil. We have discussed from your Holy Qur'an and Sahih Hadith. We have made many mistakes. Please forgive our all mistakes and accept this Tafsirul Qur'an Mahfil. Oh Allah, forgive our all sins. Oh Allah, increase our sustenance. Oh Allah, you know what is in our heart. Please fulfill our all good desires in our heart. Oh Allah, save the Muslims of the Palestine. Oh Allah, destroy the Bani Israel. وصلى الله تعالى على خير خلقه محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.